This is Event Horizon, and I'm your host, Mark Anthony Peterson. This is the podcast that takes a walk into the paranormal with a splash of conspiracy. This is the podcast that would be born if David Icke and the X-Files had a baby. Guys, welcome to episode 22. I promised you in episode 22 that I was going to ask the question, who is God? Yes, I'm sorry. I am not going to ask that question. You know what happened, the same thing that happened in episode 19. As I started researching the topic, I came across issues that I had to resolve before I could ask that question. So I had to ask the question, where's the Garden of Eden? And had to plunder my way through that to figure out that there have been at least 3 gardens in the history of humankind. You got to go back and check that out to understand why that episode was relevant and necessary before I could ask the question, who is God? Before that episode, I made the announcement almost that the key to the Mandela effect is your blood. I know that sounds so crazy, but your blood is the key to the frequency at which you vibrate. It is the source of your consciousness. And if someone disturbs your unique vibration and the connection that others have to your vibration, they change your reality. That's my argument. And I think the guys at CERN are doing that. When they punch holes in our reality, they are disturbing the unique vibrations that connect you to you across all dimensions and all universes. So not everybody is affected by the change in the timeline. Only those vibrations that were tapped into via their experiments. Those are my arguments. So I got back on track and tried to ask the question, who is God? And ran into another issue that forced me to entitle this episode, Who is the Virgin Mary? The Church's secret war on women and consciousness. Now, before we get any deeper, the disclaimers. I am not a religious expert. I'm not a physicist. I can barely even talk English. I just start with a clean sheet of paper and a fresh perspective and start working my way through the research and let it take me wherever I see it going. I analyze it from every direction and then come here and talk to you about it. That's about all. But I will say, this episode will probably be the most blasphemous, the most heretical that I have ever produced. Because I'm going to talk to you about the Virgin Mary. You know what I do in every episode. I give you the answer and then I go back and give you the details. So let's start with the answer. First, I think Dan Brown got it wrong in his books. The Holy Grail isn't Mary Magdalene. The Holy Grail is the line of women in the Bible that are capable of Parthenogenesis. Parthenogenesis, yes, the ability to self-conceive. I know that sounds crazy. You only know of one where someone self-conceived, and that was Mary, right? Wrong. The Bible is littered with examples of women who self-conceived, preserving the bloodline. Now, how did I get this idea? In 2014 and in May of 2019, 2 snakes, one named Thelma, the other named Anna, self-conceived and bore new offspring without having any contact from a male. When the offspring were examined, scientists determined that they were exact clones of their mother. They'd passed down the genetic code without having to come in contact with a male snake. Now, this self-conception or parthenogenesis occurs in a number of different species of fish, snake, sharks, but it's never been known to occur in mammals. But when it does happen, you produce a clone genetically of the original. I know what you're starting to see now and starting to think. So I'm going to keep going. And for those of you who are offended by where I'm headed, you might want to stop this episode. Number 3, does it seem crazy that a mammal could self-conceive? Doesn't seem crazy to me, because we've all been taught that man came from the sea, which suggests that there is something in our DNA that links us back to the same creatures who could self-conceive. And remember, in the Garden of Eden episode, we start that episode by saying that God's face was put upon the water. Put upon the water. He put his consciousness into the water before making man. And that water that makes up the majority of who we are as living beings was then transformed into the blood, symbolized by Jesus' action of turning water into wine, to let you know that the consciousness of God had been embedded into the DNA of man. That's the argument. So why would it seem so crazy that there would be a mammal capable of self-conception? In fact, the scientists argued with Thelma and Anna, the two pythons that self-conceived, that they were capable of doing so because the females were in the perfect ideal condition, environment, both physically and their environment, to self-conceive. As the scientists put it, they were almost in a perfect garden. Guys, I can't make this stuff up. In a perfect garden-like condition that allowed them to self-conceive, for their bodies to produce the chemical mix that would fertilize their own eggs. So before first sin, did God intend for Eve to be able to do the same thing in the garden, the perfect garden, where the bloodline in the consciousness of God could be perfectly reproduced in a line of humans? That's a question you have to ponder. After sin, Adam and Eve were forced out of the garden, the perfect condition, and parthenogenesis was no longer the option to Adam and Eve. They had to mix blood in order to populate the world. So, number 6, does this mean that man became mammal after leaving the garden, after first sin? Like I said earlier, man is said to have come from water, if we believe what science has told us about our time here on this planet. Number 7, were the descendants of Jesus among a small group of reptile mammals that were capable of self-conception? Why do I say that? As I said earlier, we've only been taught that Jesus is the only being that was brought into this world without the help of a man. That substitute for a man was God. So bringing God into the physical plane through the Virgin Mary. What we haven't been taught is that the story of Mary, the Virgin Mary, is very similar to the story of Jesus. Yes, Mary's parents couldn't conceive. An angel showed up to Mary's parents. And then Mary miraculously was born without the help of a man. In fact, it was so miraculous that Mary was kept in the temple until she was 3 years old. But we're not taught that. So if Mary was produced without the help of a man, that means her mother, Anne, isn't that ironic that the snake was Anna and her mom is Anne, self-conceived and produced Mary, making a complete and perfect clone of herself in Mary. And it can be argued that Mary did the same for Jesus. So point 9, if Mary produced Jesus in the same way Anna produced Mary, then Jesus was a clone of Mary and Mary was a clone of Anna. Point 10, if Jesus is a clone of Mary, why isn't Mary and Anna, who cloned Mary, treated like the daughters of God in the Bible? At best, they're footnotes. Mary's parents aren't even mentioned in the Bible, even though they have been granted saint status amongst Catholics. Well, the answer that's put forth is that there's this slight distinction: an immaculate conception versus virgin birth. Even though the conditions and the descriptions are almost identical, a slight distinction separates Mary from Jesus. I'm arguing that that slight distinction is only man-made, and man-made to suppress women's role in the church. I told you this one was going to start hitting hard. If you are buying any of the logic that I'm laying out that describes this lineage and the ability to reproduce in the way I've described, then you know the ultimate conclusion. Point 11. If Anna and Mary were the keys to preserving the bloodline through self-creation, through Parthenogenesis, then it's women who should be the head of the church and not men. I know, right? I just dropped a religious bomb right in the middle of everything you believe. But that's what this is suggesting. And I think there have been a significant attempt to suppress this kind of thinking within the church, because understanding it and understanding its impact on consciousness changes the world we live in. I think others also knew this. I think Leonardo da Vinci also understood what I'm talking about. I think he knew this secret, that women were the key to eternity, the key to the universe, had dominion over life. And I think he understood that Anne and Mary were the true heads of the church. Why do I say that? First, Leonardo was known for mirroring in his writing. Yeah, he would write backwards using a mirror in cursive and mirror his writing. Some argue it was to hide his thinking, to create a puzzle of sorts by writing backwards. I argue he was trying to show you the reality of the universe, the reality of what was the head of the church, a mirror, a clone of the original. So writing backwards is a way of telling you that there is something significant happening in our life, and that the preservation of the bloodline was a self-conception, a mirroring of the bloodline without the help of man. The second way that Leonardo tried to show us his thinking is in two paintings, based on what I can see: the Salvator-mundi and the Mona-Lisa. When these paintings are superimposed on top of each other, they are shown to be mirror images, suggesting that the Mona Lisa may be a portrait of Mary, and the Salvator-mundi, the Savior of the world, is Jesus. When you examine the paintings closer, you see even more hints at Leonardo's thinking. And I'll get into those deeper into the show. Point 13. Genesis 3:15 really confounds the issue because it lays out an argument that the church uses to say that Mary will crush the head of the snake. The verse reads, "I will put enmities between thee and the woman, and thy seed and her seed. She shall crush thy head, and thou shalt lie in wait for her heel." Some have said that this verse shows that Mary, the second Eve, will crush the head of the snake. I have a different take. When you look at the Ouroboros, snake eating its own tail, if I had to describe that, it would seem like it was self-destruction, eating its own heel. We all know the Ouroboros is a symbol for eternity, for renewal, for life. And if you buy the argument that I'm selling, the line of women who were capable of self-conception represent the Ouroboros. It's powerful stuff if you choose to accept it. It also means that the church would have gone to great lengths to remove women from the church, when we know from the days of Mary, both Virgin Mary and Mary Magdalene, that they were both priestesses that worked in the church. Because some of you don't know that anointing of oil or making someone a Messiah could only be done by a priestess in the church. So as we move forward from that period, women were removed from those roles in the church and eliminated from having any power. Why? Why? When women, if you are to believe what I'm arguing, are the key to life. Maybe this is why so many of the secret societies have women worship at the center of their practices. Maybe that's why we have the female goddess sitting atop the Capitol in Washington. I don't know, but let's dig into the facts now that you have my summary conclusions. Snakes, Parthenogenesis and snake symbolism. Historically, serpents and snakes represent fertility and the creative life force. As snakes shed their skin through sloughing, they are symbols of rebirth, transformation, immortality, and healing. As I mentioned, the Ouroboros, or the snake eating its tail, is a symbol of eternity and continual renewal of life. So when we started to talk about Parthenogenesis, it was amazing to me to find out in the USA Today article from May 25th, 2019, that there was a virgin birth from a captive anaconda that became pregnant without being touched by another snake. The female anaconda, or Anna, as she was called, had been living in an exhibit and gave birth to two snakes, a male and a female snake. The DNA testing confirmed that the 2-foot-long green anaconda youngsters that she produced through non-sexual reproduction were exact clones of Anna. The same act of reproduction occurred in 2014 with the world's longest snake, Thelma, a reticulated python, and she gave birth to 6 baby snakes without the help of a male. According to the USA Today article, the 11-year-old reticulated python Thelma produced 6 female offspring in June of 2012 at the Louisville Zoo in Kentucky. Prior to giving birth, this reticulated python Thelma only other contact with any other snake was with another female snake named Louise. Yes, it's the combo Thelma and Louise. Harvard professor James Hankin states that this phenomenon occurs when polar bodies or cells produced with an animal's egg that normally die or disappear behave like sperm and fuse with the egg. He goes on further to say that the number of species known to be capable of virgin birth is growing. Pythons, of course, boas, birds, sharks, and more have been confirmed to reproduce through virgin birth without the use of the male sperm. In the case of Thelma, her virgin birth may have been triggered by ideal conditions, says Bill McMahon, the zoo curator. McMahon states, "It takes a lot out of pythons to reproduce, and she had everything she needed. I fed her a really big meal, 40 pounds of chicken. She was living in an exhibit larger than the typical size. There were heating pads. Everything was optimal." Thelma was living in the Garden of Eden, capable under those conditions of self-conception. So understanding what happened to both Anna and Thelma in producing life without the use of a male, the question then comes to mind, was Eve supposed to reproduce in the same way in the garden? The famous biologist Jacques Loeb realized that the male is not necessary for reproduction, stating that a simple physochemical agent in the female is enough to bring life to bear. Dane Rutherford states, "The life force itself acts as a fundicating power. This leads the way to a creative mutation, a new product of evolution, a new type of human being who is not born from ancestors and is consequently free from the inertia and karma of man's past." That quote says it all. That if you wanted to produce a bloodline capable of reconnecting with God, it would not involve man. It would involve the woman self-conceiving and passing on a pure bloodline to the next generation. I know you guys thinking I am out there, and that if you could get a note to someone in my religious circle, you would let them know that I am being completely heretical. Maybe I am. Maybe I, again, am really dehydrated and need some kombucha. And so I'll take a swig. That's good stuff. But I don't think I'm wrong here, because the Bible gives us hints when we look at others who were born through the same process. And the Bible tells us that these beings that were produced through this process were capable of walking with God. And where was the last time we heard that? Adam and Eve. When they were still capable of walking with God, they were connected to the network and could talk literally to God. Did first sin transform man into something different? That's what I've been arguing all along. If you go back to episodes 9, 10, 11, 12, that's what I've been arguing. That before there was the before, man was something different. A silicon-based being that could talk with God. And that after first sin, everything changed. Everything had to change. We were kicked off God's network, changed into something different. Something different than even what made up the planet. Because all of those guys, our birds, our whales, our animals, still seem to be able to connect with the vibrations of the planet and the universe. We're the ones that still cannot. So was man transformed after first sin into something that required the mixing of blood to reproduce? And that the last lines of those reptile mammals that could became the vessels, the Holy Grails that passed down that bloodline to redeem humanity? I think some scientists would say yes. Because humankind, according to scientists, evolved from a bag-like sea creature that had a large mouth and no anus, and moved by wiggling its way up onto the shore. If that's what we evolved from, creatures capable of that sort of reproduction, then everything produced has a direct connection to the source, because the source produced the original. Yeah, Adam and Eve didn't go through the normal birthing process. They were created from nothingness and infused the consciousness of God. So if Eve self-conceived and reproduced, she was reproducing the source. Is this starting to make sense? Or are you already ready to turn the podcast off and report me to the Vatican? If you're still with me, we must ask the question, was Jesus descended from a line of female reptile mammals capable of parthenogenesis? Well, according to worldmysteries.com, Jesus may not have been the only Savior reproduced through virgin birth. In fact, when you start looking at all the major world religion, that's exactly how those saviors or those prophets were reproduced, through virgin birth. It's said that Leonardo da Vinci was born through virgin birth. Joan of Arc, St. Catherine, Plato, and many, many other geniuses, visionaries throughout histories were claimed to have been born that way, including the Buddha. The Buddha's mother conceived her son when in a state of quote-unquote blissful meditation under a banyan tree. Krishna, again, virgin birth, where he both inspired and conceived and became the offspring. So Jesus is not the only historical figure to have been put in the category of virgin birth without the intervention of the male sperm. But let's exclude those individuals who are not part of the Bible and zoom in on those who are, that share the same type of birthing process as Jesus in the Bible. And as you might guess, they share the same bloodline as Jesus. Noah. Yes, grandfather Methuselah was born, and born so different looking, so conscious and capable upon his birth that even his father feared him. Some of the text that's not in the Bible, the Dead Sea Scrolls, describe a situation where Noah's father had not been present where his wife was for more than 6 months. And yet she conceived and gave birth to Noah, which left the father thinking that something had gone amiss in his absence. But his father, Methuselah, said, "No, this is your child, conceived through God." So a birth without the use of the male sperm in the case of Noah. And when you read Genesis 6 and 9, listen to how it describes Noah. Genesis 6 and 9. Noah was a just man and perfect in his generations, and Noah walked with God. The term perfect in his generation seems to mean that Noah was genetically pure and not a hybrid created through the process that had populated the planet. Walking with God is a phrase that was exclusively used for Adam and Eve before sin. But I don't want to give all the credit to Noah. The credit should be given to the women who gave birth, because they were the vessels. They were the Holy Grails. In fact, Noah's brother's wife also gave birth without the intervention of the male sperm. The second book of Enoch contains a section called the Exaltation of Melchizedek, which says that Melchizedek was born of a virgin, Sophronim, the wife of Ner, who was Noah's brother. Now, the second book of Enoch goes on to say the child came out of his mother after she had died and sat beside her corpse already physically developed, clothed, speaking and blessing the Lord, and this child bore the mark of the priesthood. 40 days later, Melchizedek was taken by the archangel Gabriel to the Garden of Eden and thus preserved from the deluge that would come when the flood wiped out the planet. So here you have two examples, Noah and Melchizedek, where Melchizedek was taken into the Garden of Eden by Gabriel. Now, guys, let's back up a minute. In my episode about the Garden of Eden, remember I mentioned to you that I thought the first garden was not in this physical plane. This is further proof that that first garden was not, because Gabriel took Melchizedek there to avoid being killed in the water deluge that Noah would participate in. You got to go back and listen to these episodes, guys. I think I'm on the right track. So you got Noah and Melchizedek born without the help of a man, self-conception by the women who were capable of doing that. Isaac is another example in the Bible. And according to Rabbi Samuel Glazer, the Lord visited Sarah, his mother, who was supposed to be barren and unable to bear a child, and passed to her the divine cup of blessing, or the cup of divine blessing, when they came into the tent to have dinner with Abraham? What is the cup of divine blessing? Because whatever it is, Sarah then became capable of having a child. She was able to conceive. And according to the arguments of the rabbi, that conception occurred at the moment of the receiving of the cup of divine blessing, implying that there was no male intervention. So Isaac would be another example, and Mary would be the next example. Now, who is Mary? Mary's parents are Saint Anne and Saint Joachim. They're not mentioned in the Bible. I think intentionally so that you don't start to ask the same questions that I'm asking, that if their births were identical, why aren't they treated the same in religious text? And when looked up in the Hebrew text, means gracious or full of grace, or grace or mercy. In the medieval Christian tradition, Anne was the name assigned to the Virgin Mary, and her father, as I mentioned, Joachim, was her father. Was her father. In the proto-evangelisms of James, written around 150 A.D., these two were described, Anne and Joachim, as a wealthy couple who were infertile for many years, and that Mary's father, Joachim, fasted for 40 days and 40 nights in hopes of having a child. But then an angel came to Mary's mother. An angel came to Anne and told her that she would give birth, which led to much rejoicing on the part of Joachim and Anne. And then Anne conceived of Mary. This story is not told in the Bible because it's the same story that was told to Mary when she was to give birth to Jesus. An angel arrives, announces the birth. She becomes pregnant and gives birth to Jesus without the intervention of the male. But in the time of Mary, they looked upon that power as being divine, because Mary was consecrated to the Lord and went on to live in the temple until the age of 3. So she was a priestess. She was also the relative of Elizabeth, the wife of the priest Zachariah in the priestly division, and was part of the lineage of Aaron and the tribe of Levi. Guys, do I think I'm on the right track with this stuff? I do. Because there's symbology throughout the Bible that points to the fact that what I'm saying has some merit. The symbol of the fish that you see on the back of people's cars is supposed to represent Jesus. Again, I think that harkens to this repto-mammal convergence that is the carrier of the pure bloodline that's capable of self-conception. That symbol also, in the days of what we consider pagan religions, was used to represent fertility and, more specifically, the female reproductive organs. We also have in the Bible where Jesus multiplied the fish and the loaves of bread to feed the hungry, to preserve life, that the fish was the key to life. So I think we have some symbology there that hints in the direction that I'm talking about in this episode, that the female in the symbology of the fish both in terms of nourishment and life, were the key, and that Jesus, as the offspring of Mary, the clone of Mary, was the duality that is the carrier of salvation. I know it seems kind of weird, but that's what it points to. I know what some of you are thinking, that there are other ways to think about this virgin birth, because there could have been three possible scenarios to explain the passage of genetic matter. One is that Jesus received all of Mary's genetics, right? A perfect clone of Mary copied into Jesus. The second scenario is that Jesus could have received half his genetics from Mary and half from God, kind of miraculously infused at the time of conception. Or, finally, Jesus could have been an implant, received all his DNA from God, and Mary was simply the vessel. In either case, the vessels conceived without human man intervening, making them the Holy Grail, the holy cups that passed down the genetic bloodline to save humanity. And that reality has not been witnessed or exclaimed within religious dogma, but hidden and suppressed. The arguments for immaculate conception versus virgin birth, in my opinion, are just minor distinctions as a way to elevate the male over the female, to give the divine power to the male influence while excluding the divine power from the female. And in this case, if you believe the argument that's being made of self-conception, it would be reversed. That the key to life and sustaining life would be with these vessels, with the ability to sustain and create life without the need of the male. This is also going to seem blasphemous and heretical, but the facts align perfectly with the arguments that I'm making. And I think others, like Leonardo da Vinci, understood this. I believe the Mona Lisa represents both the virgin birth of Mary and Jesus. When you look at both the masculine and the feminine that are captured in that piece of art. There's also imagery within the painting itself that suggests that Leonardo understood that there was some sort of amphibian or reptile influence on the DNA of the bloodline. When you look in the lower left-hand corner of the Mona Lisa, there is a winding road that is suspiciously similar to a snake. When you look even closer at the head of the road, it looks like the open mouth of a serpent spitting out an egg, which would be the symbol for renewal of life or the birth of the universe. Leonardo was known for anagrams, and when you reshuffle the Mona Lisa, you can come up with lame saint, or you can come up with osanliam. O space S-A-N liam, L-I-A-M. Translated, Saint Liam, which Liam means in Hebrew, my nation, my people. In Irish, it means strong-willed protector, resolute protector. So I think Leonardo was basically telling us that this portrait is the portrait of Mary, describing the full life and connections that Mary had to the divine bloodline, particularly when you examine the winding snake-like road that's in that portrait. Leonardo was also known for mirroring, writing backwards and forwards, and mirroring his text. Some say, again, as a way to protect the learnings that he had gathered. I don't think that was the rationale. I think it was a nod to the fact that he understood self-conception, cloning, to preserve the bloodline. But when you introduce the Salvator-mundi to this equation, you get something that is fascinating. On the website, geometricacodes.com, and I'm going to put all of these in the show notes, all my sources in the show notes, so that you can follow the trail that I followed to come to these conclusions. They superimpose the images of Leonardo's Salvator-mundi and the Mona-Lisa. And what they conclude is that the feminine and the masculine attributes are mirrored between the two paintings. The website states, the works, the Mona Lisa and Salvator-mundi, are an illustrious match of several key factors, most notably the background and the eyes of Mundi and Mona Lisa, suggesting that these were companion pieces. They were painted around the same time, so Leonardo may have intended for these to be companion pieces that shared a mirroring effect, male-female mirroring effect, and when superimposed, almost identically align with background's eyes, facial features, to suggest that what was in one was passed to the other. Please go to my Facebook page. When this show airs, I am going to post the images of the superimposed Mona Lisa and the Salvator-mundi so that you can see just how perfectly these paintings align, suggesting that there's some sort of synchronicity between the paintings. Some could argue that the Vitruvian Man is also a symbol of this same sort of argument of male-female synchronicity between Mary and Jesus and the passing of the bloodline. So if Leonardo is trying to show this in his paintings and his works, and if all of this that I've laid out has some factual basis and some merit, why would the church actively suppress women's role to keep women from being leaders and or possibly the head of the church? I think it's obvious that if you remove the male influence from life, as what is suggested in Parthenogenesis or self-conception, then you establish a beginning and an end to that life. Yeah. Male fostered reproduction creates a finite beginning and end, whereas female self-conception ensures the continuous reproduction of life and can possibly pass the pure bloodline in the case of what's described here, what I call the real Holy Grail. In the early days of the Bible, or the early days of religion, reincarnation was inherent in most of what was accepted dogma for many of the religions around the world. The circle of life, as was described in The Lion King, the snake eating its own tail. And I think a church built around the fact that the woman is the source and has dominion over life changes the way you think about the power of the church and its control over your consciousness and this physical reality. It also starts to throw hints as to what God could possibly be. If we're made in God's image, and if women are capable of recreating life without the male, what does that say about the possibility of what God would represent as a dimensional being beyond the dimensions that we can recognize? This is why I had to go down this road to figure out what God is. Because if Jesus represented God on earth, I had to take one step back to say, well, what is Mary? And when I started digging into Mary, I realized that there were dozens of other Marys in the Bible who had done the exact same thing she did, which was be born without the help of a male and then turn around and gave birth to offspring without the help of a male. That throws a lot of light on everything that we have been taught and taught to believe from a male perspective. Everything from what God looks like to who controls reality and how that reality should operate. So given that, let's tackle that last part, that battle that is put forth that says, I will put enmity between you and woman, and between your descendants and her descendants. He will crush your head and you will bruise his heel. That's one version of the passage. There's so many translations and different takes of if it's a male or female persuasion in the Bible when it comes to this verse. A second interpretation, I will put enmities between thee, the serpent, and the woman, and thy seed and her seed, and she shall crush thy head, and thou shalt lie in wait for her heel. Now, let's take this piece by piece. Enmities, let's define that. It means to be caused to become entangled in something. Whales become enmeshed in drift nets. Synonyms are entangle, ensnare, snare, trap, entrap, ensnarl, embrawl, involve, caught up, mixed up, bogged down, mired, are all synonyms of the word. It could also mean involve in a difficult situation. So somehow the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent are going to become involved, entangled, ensnared, trapped, embroiled, if we are to read that part of the scripture correctly. Now, what about the crushing of the head of the serpent? As with the Ouroboros, you see the snake eating itself. And I think what this symbolizes is that the Holy Grail, the cupbearers, will become now the head, the new head to the eternity creating process, to the life bearing process. So it takes over as the new head once the old head is crushed. But there still will be an intertwining, a mixing of the seeds between her and the serpent. What about the heel? She will crush thy head, and thou shalt lie in wait for the heel. The heel bone contains the starting point for the Achilles tendon, which attaches to the calf and the muscles in the heel. The placement of the ankle and the heel help shape the area of the foot known as the arc or the arch. The arch has many meanings in religious texts in dealing with initiations and ceremonies and removal of old cultural ways. walking through an archway represents sloughing off. Notice the terminology, sloughing off, because it's the same thing a snake does to its skin, of the old and moving into a new phase of life. So arches are also symbolic of the expansion of the sky. Arcs are symbolic of new life. So what this verse essentially means to me, it is the written version of the Mona Lisa. Osanliam, great protector, sacred nation, that the female is now the head after crushing the head, and that the serpent bruising the heel or connecting to the heel completes the circle and opens the archway for the sloughing off of the old ways and moving into a new phase of life. The Mona Lisa. That's what it represents. Why is all this important? Because all of this symbolizes what I've been saying in earlier podcasts. The blood is a time machine. It's an eternal time machine. It captures all of who you were, all of what you are, and all of what you will be. And that the female form is the symbol for that. And that this capability of self-conceiving preserves that bloodline that gives us the connection back to the Creator. Because we had been kicked off, we had been changed, we had been converted, we had been put on a finite path of beginning and ending, whereas the new paradigm is one of eternity. None of what we are ever dies, and the female form is the vehicle for that eternity. So if you're a female listener to this show and fairly religious, I don't want you to see this episode as blasphemous. I want you to see it for what it is. That you should not be afraid to have a voice in the temple, because you are the temple. And that if what I am saying is true, then Jesus was Mary and Mary was Jesus. Clones. And everything that is bestowed upon him in the eyes of God should be bestowed upon you. Guys, thank you for listening. I hope all of you come back for the next episode. I'm hoping that I can finally ask the question of who is God. I can't promise you that I'm going to answer it in the next episode, but I am getting closer. As I said, I'm no religious scholar. I'm no physicist. I'm just a guy asking questions and then sharing the answers that I find with you. In the bonus show, I'm going to go into a little more detail around the consciousness aspect of what we're talking about here. That's going to be a live episode. Please join us by following us on Spreaker and participate. Get in the chats, ask questions, call in, and let's have a live dialogue around this topic. Until next time, guys, peace.